science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
All right, well, welcome back to the second part of our conversation here at Architecture Talk. I'm resuming a conversation that I'm having with Sarosh Anklesaria, Shubhra Raje, and Riyaz Tayyibji. And we are discussing the prehistory, particular circumstances, and perhaps we can talk a little bit more about the prognosis and path ahead of the circumstances surrounding and the fallout from the proposed demolition of 14 dormitories of Louis Kahn's IIM in the context of a new master plan. Let's try and turn our efforts into a little bit more as architects and thinkers into the path ahead. Yeah, I mean we know what the history is and where we are, and we can start again with IIM in particular, which they are going to they have temporarily suspended their decision, but who knows what's going to happen ahead. But what is your approach to the concept of modernist, I don't know, whatever the term is, heritage or preservation or conservation, or the management of the change of the modernist heritage? Let's just say, what should be done? Shubhra, you already started to talk a little bit about this. What is the right path forward, let's say, for IIM?
Of course, there are two parts to the question here, but they'll sort of come together a little bit. And I think it's something you see globally, right? That I hope that everybody here, at least, doesn't believe in a sort of a rigid physical object only kind of a conservation. And therefore, I think what also constituted our letter, but even beyond, is the conservation efforts can't be separate from their larger master plan ambitions, primarily because at some point, existing activities and functions within physical structures may need to be questioned, because that is just the life of institutions,
Yeah, programming changes,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Not only that, currently I think the master plan also suffers in everybody's imagination from the East and the West campus, or the old and the new campus. And therefore, even the way in which one may begin to reimagine existing buildings is constricted and constrained. Therefore, then, additional pressure that, oh, these don't function as dormitories, or this doesn't function as a library anymore, or these don't function as blah, blah, blah. And therefore, as we know, any conservation effort cannot be separated from the larger master plan, because if you're beginning to reimagine activities and beginning to sort of reimagine affinities between activities, in the spirit of reusing and repurposing that which is already built. So again and again, I keep coming back to the fact that it's not just that we are saving somebody's signature work. What we are also, as I think professionals in today's day and age, is saying it is time we sort of work with clients and users even to shift aspirations from development as only building new to, if we do need to use resources, let us not use material resource heavy methods, rather human resource heavy methods. Restorations take more time and energy in terms of people, but use less material. And especially buildings like Ghanaian architecture, which just already have so much material embodied in them. So where I'm going with this is that the way forward for the IIM, they will not be able to separate the conservation aspirations, ambitions, or lack thereof from the overall master plan.
So you're talking about the the current master plan almost sort of proposes a demolition of these things.
The current master plan is on a track that is impatient. I call it sort of impatient and sort of violent in that sense, that it has absolutely no patience to move away from the status quo of how architectural practices run, which is, you have problems with the dormitories, fine, let us build new dormitories.
Destroy and replace.
Which means that suddenly the scope becomes a little larger than just, do you include one more building in your heritage plan or not? But I think any conservation practitioner, or even any practitioner these days, I think we should sort of erase all these disciplinary and specialized categories. It's meaningless if you don't look at the overall master plan. I mean, I just love to always go back to, what they've done with the Nizamuddin and the Humayun's tomb precinct, that the conservation began not with the object. That was literally the last part. The actual restoration of the physical tomb was the last aspect of a sort of reimagining that community. And therefore, something like that needs to happen at IIM.
So how would you reimagine the master plan?
First of all, one would reimagine by asking the IIM if there is such a lot of pressure on, for instance, accommodating everything within the campus boundary, because that was the way institutions were imagined for a particular reason. A lot of the times, these institutions were built at the edges of cities or in the middle of nowhere, and there were no amenities, which is why you housed faculty and students within a campus. At least a question can begin to be asked: what does it mean to be a campus within a city versus a campus somewhere else? Now, these are not unique questions. It is just that in order to innovate within architecture, you have to question and reimagine patterns of living, patterns of what institutions may mean, patterns of what is student housing in the center of the city, which is what IIM is in now, rather than when it was built, where it was in the fields. Suddenly, to extend Riyaz's conversation about when there are pressures on land, that is one, which means IIM can't indiscriminately keep going and buying new land, because there is none in that area of Ahmedabad, in that neighborhood of IIM.
No, but also, Shubhra, if I may interrupt, there is also in Ahmedabad an incredible amount of modern facility that was built that can be used institutionally. I mean, you could take Prevava Hall, for example.
And it's the imagination of an institute in conjunction with practitioners of and within built environment, where suddenly you look at neighborhoods and cities as a resource and not just a physical boundary that came about because of other reasons. All I'm trying to say is that it needs something beyond just how do you cram X number of program in Y square footage or acreage of institution. Now, these are questions that are not architectural alone. They are also pushing institutions, especially in India, which so far have always operated on the premise of exclusivity, citadel, nature. But there are successful examples of universities within cities from medieval times, actually. It's
Sure.
recent thing. So anyway, that would be one way, one example.
Now that would do what? That would, reducing the programming pressure on the master plan would do what? Would enable us to kind of keep the buildings? What would it do?
It would perhaps enable us to keep buildings, reuse them, repurpose them to uses that are more relevant to that neighborhood, keeping IIM's programs in mind. Also, IIM, where it's located currently, is at the southern end of an entire university area, which itself, again, has multiple redundancies. If you look at that neighborhood of Ahmedabad, you have 3 or 4 auditoriums, you have 5 or 6 libraries, you have many, many facilities. Now, all these, to begin to look at the idea of and notions of consortiums. I know there are administrative problems, every time you try to shift the status quo, you will have challenges because they are uncharted territories. So all I mean is growth, development, innovation is not merely stylistic.
No, but it's ironic, isn't it, Shubhra, Vikram, that in some sense what Shubhra is describing is what IIM was like in 1962. What I mean is that it worked out of NID. Okay, you know, the same thing happened at SEPT, where it was a badminton hall. There is a legacy of institutional structures when you consider the Ahmedabad Education Society, when you consider Gujarat University, when you consider SEPT, NID, IIM. You know that Vikram Sarabhai, Kasturbai Lalbhai, other eminent people who were founders of these looked at a synergy between institutions that helped all of them develop together. And we know that IIM, the buildings and the institutions were centered at NID. We know that SEPT ran out of a badminton hall.
NID ran out of Sanskar Kendra when they started.
Sanskar Kendra. So I mean, we've got histories and legacies here where this is not unique, and this was how. Go on.
Yeah, and also to go back to your question about the sort of conservatism of Ahmedabad society on the one hand, and a certain progressive streak also. All these institutions are testimonies of that, including IIM and also its making, in terms of all its patrons had frugality at their core of practice. And so did Ahmedabad. And somewhere along the line of, and Ashok Chatterjee of NID talks about it as well, somewhere along the line, what was practice, therefore what was a verb, whether it was in terms of a certain frugality, a certain sense of service, became a brand, no? It became stylized. So, and Ahmedabad architectural scene is as culpable as anything else, where suddenly exposed brick and concrete that grew out of a certain sense of frugality, never mind that it married well with the brutal period of Corbusier or Kahn's preoccupation with the ruins. These were just happy meetings. But at the heart of it, these patrons of these architects had a certain sense of Gandhian frugality at their heart. And so did Ahmedabad society, for instance. I mean, you know, there's a separate history altogether about the Ahmedabadi millowners versus the Marwadi ones, you know, who eventually won out. An Ahmedabadi millowner, you wouldn't be able to tell. I mean, they would have two pairs of their own cotton cloth trousers. And they may be the richest guys in the state, but you wouldn't know that kind. To then suddenly the brick and concrete became a brand. So if you were an architect from Ahmedabad, or rather, if you wanted an exposed brick building, you came to an architect from Ahmedabad. And the architectural scene in Ahmedabad also made hay of all this. Anyway, then as soon as it becomes a brand or style, you and I know that then it becomes susceptible to the opinions. So today it's trending up, and tomorrow it's trending down. So we sort of dig our own traps, no, in terms of, rather than being pragmatic in order to be innovative, you sort of make it into something that now becomes exclusive or anything. So anyway, so what I'm trying to say is that at the heart of the city has always been a certain modest pragmatism to keep living and practicing with a certain frugality. That has unfortunately been translated into low cost at the one hand. And then if you want to distinguish yourself from that, you start becoming extravagant. And it's, to me, I think even IIM as a leader in its own right has an opportunity to think about what does it mean to be a premier institute engaged with the city. And, you know, everyone from our alma mater, Sarosh's and mine, Cornell, to have had to deal with that, no? From being the citadel on the hill to how do you outreach and engage with the very community you are part of. So Cornell and Ithaca, blah, blah.
No, I want to sort of seize in on that. Perhaps it is that Gandhian dry state insistence on frugality that produces an equivalent obsession with excess as its counterpoint. there is a reason why Ahmedabad had to produce Modi for the very same reason.
Right.
So the chickens are coming home to roost.
Yeah, there is sense to that.
Sarosh?
But go ahead.
I just don't know at what level to talk about this anymore. So
Let's
we can
stay
talk
with
about this at the
architecture.
level of IIM, or
Let's
we can
start
talk
with bird flu.
bird flu.
Bird flu is rampant in Ahmedabad right now, and the chickens are home to roost.
No, I think there are
go ahead.
there are two trajectories here that might be worth excavating a little bit. One is what does this mean for IIM? What does this mean for the dormitories? What are our thoughts, suggestions, and potential vectors for these particular buildings? And then, of course, the larger question, which I think is really important, which is one of public advocacy. And I think what our campaign tries to do is also that which is a project of public advocacy, because what's happening here will definitely happen to Tagore Hall. It will happen to Sanskar Kendra. It will happen perhaps to Gandhi Ashram, Korea's building.
Coming next.
Coming next, yes.
Right. And to countless works of modernism in India and across the world. So I think that there is a big question of also public advocacy. So one of the things that we have been running into, and Riyaz can speak more to this, is the huge obsession both within the governing council and outside with students and people who are not intimately familiar with this, which is one of structural compliance. And that seems to override all other questions, right? If this building is not safe, then all your talk about memory, nostalgia, all that falls apart. It's not going to hold up.
Yeah.
So one aspect of advocacy is explaining what does structural safety mean, and I'll leave that to Riyaz to mind. But I also want to touch upon a few other things that Shubhra brought up also. The question of ecology is really important and cannot be talked about enough, which is to say that first we must disentangle this old and very problematic relationship between form and function, which is very modernist, very recent. And the history of architecture, the history of cities, our cities across the world show that it is the worst way of looking at patrimony, that somehow function has to be married to form. There is no reason for that. And so these buildings can be creatively repurposed, and that opens up a whole host of different imaginations for what can happen to them.
Give me some ideas, Sarosh.
Institute is expanding. They need new conference halls. They need new lecture rooms. They need new meeting rooms. I mean, there is an endless array of different options that one can imagine. One can imagine it as a box of even fluid changing programs if it is, imaginatively done. And I think in that maybe there is here some scope for even an architectural competition to really keep the ethos of the building, but to imagine new programs there. But I think a fundamental rethinking of conservation is important here. That is a larger project of public education. That conservation doesn't mean fossilization. It doesn't mean that we are just going to keep the bones of the visual imagery of these buildings. It's not Taj Mahal, yeah. Absolutely not. The other thing is, and Shubhra spoke about this, which is the question of embodied energy. When these buildings were built, we did not have, although frugality was important, embodied energy in the way in which we think of it now was not a thing. And so if you think of current, even the most sort of recent debates on architecture and ecology have focused so much on operative costs, right? So we put insulation in our buildings and we try to reduce operative costs of these buildings. But only now is there a pervasive sense, quite a serious understanding of the incredible amount of embodied energy that has gone into making these bricks. And so one should account for, when you make a new structure, the embodied energy in these buildings is going to be tremendous, especially if you make a new structure out of brick. And then the last thing I want to say is that public advocacy also means a certain understanding that the past and that memory is part of a rich production of space, something along the lines of, Kevin Lynch talks about memory in this kind of way, that the city is rich, the city is a palimpsest because it is a series of layers. And that as soon as we start removing these layers, and we think of modernism as a layer that can be discarded easily, but that in and of itself discards a very important phase of institution building in India that has Nehruvian legacies, that has, but also, like we've been talking about, local histories, local memories that are so important. And so it is important to remove Kahn as a kind of hagiographic project, right? It is not a project of hagiography, but it is one of micro histories of institution building, of a certain post-independence climate in India that was so important. And if you look at some of the most important institutes in India today, they have their origins in that moment. And so, that is also part of this kind of larger project of public advocacy.
Let's talk about that for 1 minute, Sarosh. It seems to me that this public memory, public history, current ethos has a kind of Oedipal character to it.
Yes.
Which is that the desire precisely to erase one's own father, if one says the Nehruvian state gave birth to the Indian nation state, correct? I mean, or the Indian nation as we have it today. It's in a sense traditional to blame one's father or one's mother of all our ills, right? I mean, and so that's why you see this in the public sphere also, is to lash out against that period. So that's the problem with memory, is that memory is very selective. Memory is how we remember it, and it becomes a battlefield. So perhaps this is a battlefield.
But it could also just be, I just want to leave it with this one thought, that maybe the way in which history is crafted doesn't have to have a singular narrative, that somehow India has this kind of Nehruvian legacy, the sort of history that has been written, and it immediately creates a kind of polarization, right? You either have the kind of Nehruvian legacy or you have all these other voices. But maybe there is a moment, there is a capacity here of what I'm calling micro histories, but there are all these other voices that went into making IIM.
Yeah.
I was shocked when I came across this piece by Kathleen James Chakrabarty, where she talks very briefly about this beautiful moment when Louis Kahn was about to lose the project because Kasturbai Lalbhai writes to him and says, you just cannot make up your mind on what schema to develop for, you keep, like a typical architect, you keep changing the final design. So if you don't have a final design by such and such date, the project's over. And she says that it was Anant Raje who, and Kahn, by the way, at that point in time, Kahn had fixed the design of the dormitories. So that he was aware of, he knew. But it was Raje who picked up his sketches for the institute and drew them up. That's what Kathleen James Chakrabarty says in her piece. And they managed to save the project. Now this idea that this is a Western architect who somehow comes to India, again, like Riyaz was saying, this large narrative one should talk about these micro histories and make these connections again, because I think that's where it becomes rich and meaningful.
Yeah, no, and I think one should hopefully be at a stage of maturity, globally in India and in the world, where we don't have to knee-jerk, constantly keep acting out, keep repeating this old sort of Oedipal narrative again and again and again. We should have a certain maturity to both manage change and transformation without this kind of erasure. Riyaz, what were you going to say about that?
So it doesn't have to be a battle, because you said it's a battle.
I think it doesn't have to be a battle. And where I was going with that is also this the trajectory of memory that Vikram brought in. And I for a long time I've been thinking about this in terms of the way that we institutionalize memory. And I think this is an important part because there are too few storytellers about the buildings that we've built in this period. There are not enough stories that are shared. If you talk to architects, we have wonderful stories about modern architectures that we share completely within our own community. Have we actually learned to talk and share those stories with a larger community? I think for the very first time, I've seen it happen in the last 3 weeks, where people from the user community, the alumni community, the city, or are trying to talk about the same experience using their own stories. And I think that this is, when you start doing that, the conflict and what you say, it's a battlefield, completely dissipates, because there's a shared ground if you can weave stories together. And if you can't, then I think we have to accept that is not a legacy for everyone. And I think this is the risk that architects must take in even with IIM. So I would say that the risk is not, it's not a fait accompli that these buildings should stand. That is not what the petition is about, because the kind of shared stories and memories and the ways that we are able to kind of take it forward is the only authentic reason for keeping Kahn or not keeping Kahn, or those buildings.
What would you do, Riyaz? What would you do?
No, so I'm coming back to the advocacy part and elaborating on it that Sarosh brought up. I think that, and this is particular to India, we haven't written enough. We haven't talked enough to a larger audience. You look at in the last 20 days, the number of architectural pieces in the newspaper is astounding. I would like to say that perhaps in 20 years, except for Gautam Bhatia, there hasn't been this much architecture in the news. And I'm talking across the country. And I'm saying that you have to be able to talk. You've got the, Vikram, 4 days ago, you've got the economic advisor to the government of India talking architecture. If I talked economics, I know where that would go. Okay, but the point is now people are talking about structure, they're talking about architecture, they're talking about conservation, they're talking about old and new. The language is raw, it's immature, but we haven't done it for 40 years. So you don't expect people to suddenly sprout eloquent and be in this very sophisticated argument or conversation about architecture.
And to that point, somebody else recently asked me, that isn't it remarkable that because we went through the trauma of Pragati Maidan coming down, right. And someone was asking me the difference between the two, and what we realized was here the sort of community that we call user group or whatever was in some way a little more tangible. And had it not been for, let's say, the alumni engagement, had it not been for people who had in one form or another been through IIM, and ironically, the very openness of those campuses in the 1980s meant that the current journalists who are writing had cycled through IIM, they weren't even management students. They were just part of the neighborhood. And these are the people who are talking at least about, in one way or another, suddenly it is not just the self-referentiality of the architectural world talking about, in fact, strangely, the architectural world is talking more about Kahn and authorship. The articles that are out there and what the alumni are talking about are their experiences. And it's just so wonderful to have finally something post-independence, something more recent than 100 years old, where people are talking about buildings and architecture in their voice and not in some adopted voice. So that has been a revelation. So therefore,
to take that point forward, Shubhra, is what you said earlier. The documentation of that is something that architects have, and I think it is important that architects look at this because it must be a kind of not a post-occupancy understanding, but a kind of how life inhabits the building understanding of it, rather than this is the genesis of building understanding, which is mostly what our understandings of or narratives and stories about these buildings are. Oh, this is how it came about. So I mean, in some sense, architects are wonderful with origin myths of these buildings, but not about the life myths that continue and sustain them through a larger period of time. And the origin myths are great. They're great to tell people why it's important, but they're not sufficient to sustain collective story making and importance building over larger periods of time.
And so maintenance is not just a maintenance of bricks and mortar and concrete, but it's also a maintenance of memory, a cultivation of a larger story that is a living, breathing work in and of itself.
Absolutely.
No, I think, and Shubhra, you have to take this up in the way that maintenance allows you to revisit the building. What has been part of our conversation on multiple occasions, that the user becomes the partly author of the building, and I think that's a beautiful way.
Yes, absolutely. So it's well, you said it. So, but it's another way of keeping the past alive, because I mean, we do this. We are familiar with it. Every Diwali, for instance, we clean our homes. We wash, we spring clean. I mean, even that term, spring cleaning, is a chance to revisit your old attic spaces. And with each time you revisit it, you sort of, you refresh it in a sense, no? And that's how you keep it alive. And whether it is that Merrill, Lederman, Euclides, or whoever, who actually sort of talks about maintenance then as something which is as creative a force as anything else, this attitude to bring it even in this conversation about conservation preservation. It's not just about the past, it's about keeping the past alive. Frankly, for me, it's been fascinating to talk to alumni groups, etc., about this issue of maintenance. We maintain our bodies and not complain about it. I mean, we don't go around saying, why do I have to brush my teeth every day? And it is the same with even their new buildings are going to start aging from the day they are made. And the distinctions between aging and deterioration, for instance, these kind of, I think it's Prem Chandavakar who often talks about now that we've been so self-referential in terms of our talking about architecture, because we talk to each other, we build for each other also. And it's so refreshing actually to be able to talk about other aspects, other facets of the built environment and find new languages to approach the same thing. So in a strange way, this month has been a way of revisiting things that previously were arduous in completely refreshed ways. And so way forward, we are already on it. We are already on this way because we are sort of revisiting various things.
I just want to say, I just want to say that maybe the hope is also that this conversation, this way of thinking, this idea of maintenance is something that falls on the ears of the governing council, because I have to say, to give them credit, they responded to our first letter and they sent us a response saying, here is a response, which was the letter that they wrote to stakeholders. But what I appreciated about that was that it acknowledged us as stakeholders. And so one hopes that these are conversations that also is something that they hear, and that they can then rethink this idea of either erasure or conservation as a fossilized thing, but that there is a whole range of options, a whole range of possibilities that exist between those two poles.
But also the earlier point about the master plan. I mean, in some sense, it's deeply ironic that if we are to go by the IIM's, the director's letters, and are told that even before 2014, when conservation architects were involved, issues of maintenance and upkeep have always been a problem for IIM. And if you imagine that to be a truth, it is astounding that they're building the way they are building and the materials they're building with on the West Campus. Because in 70 years from now, when those buildings are the age of Kahn's buildings, I do not think either the architect or their administration has thought what will be the kind of maintenance and material processes that they will have to use at that stage to keep buildings safe or to keep buildings maintained. There is, and I will say that there is this notion, and it's particular to perhaps India, where the modern building is thought of as pakka, and it has always been thought of as pakka. And I mean, recently I'm actually in the process of restoring a house designed by Claude Batley's partner, which my parents happen to own. It's incredible that it's passed under a rural house tax regime that considers it kacha. It's going to be 100 years old in 2 years' time, but it's considered kacha because it's not made in concrete. And I think that this idea of pakka and the kind of connotations that it has, that it had when you built it in the 50s and 60s, that it had less maintenance than wood and stone and all the natural materials, and it was insect-free and all of that, has given a misconception that these buildings don't require maintenance. And that somehow, if you were to build everything in concrete, it will not require. This brick is a big problem.
And also this conflation between permanence and no maintenance.
Right.
The two are completely different things.
Right.
And there is another.
Sorry, go on, sir.
No, finish.
No. So, and the conflation between permanence and structural stability and longevity and durability. All of that, which is playing out so specifically in the narratives that the administration is putting forward. And Sarosh, if you don't mind, I'll get into a little bit of that structural part.
I was wanting you to do that. Yes.
Yeah, because on that front, and there's this whole sense that the buildings, and this is the words in the director's letter, is that a moderate earthquake will cause minor damage, and a major earthquake will cause significant damage. That's pretty true for a new building as much as it is for a retrofitted building. And no structural engineer is giving you a guarantee that the building will stand. What they're giving you is a reasonable kind of life safety, exactly. Yeah. And so this kind of sense that you've got a product for which you have to have guarantees is it's a misconception, particularly in the management world, which is doing the rounds in an extremely pervasive manner. And I think that when Sarosh talks about advocacy, there are so many misconceptions of what a seismic design building is, and what its aims are and what the assumptions are. It's assumed to be absolute. You don't design a hospital the same way you design a dormitory. You certainly design it for higher specifications of resistance, etc., etc. So I think just that the relativity of these positions and that decisions are taken by designers when they are conceiving these and developing these, and they have repercussions on cost. And also that when you compare retrofitting with a new building, the cost has to be to the same spec of behavior in seismic conditions. So, I mean, all of these things require unpacking in a way that a layperson can understand. And I think it's something that's become really important because of the way it's being used to demolish buildings without reason.
I wanted to just bring in one last thing in which I think fits neatly in this conversation, or can be considered in this conversation, which is that empathy must override the kind of pragmatics of function and structure and all of that, because I think empathy is what is the most urgent and lacking in this conversation. And so if you have empathy, then the Katsura Imperial Palace in Japan, the screens are made out of rice paper. That building has been around for 300 years. So if you have empathy, the building will stay forever, or for as long as the empathy lasts. no matter what the material is. And sometimes one realizes that buildings can be brought back, which is also very fascinating. Like the Barcelona Pavilion, which was demolished, didn't exist for 50 years and was rebuilt in the 80s. Or the building by, help me out here, the church in Firmini,
yeah.
Well,
that never existed.
Which was never built, but it was built posthumously, or built much later. The same with the FDR Memorial in Khan's own, that was built on Roosevelt Island recently.
What is the cause? What is the reason for lack of empathy for these buildings? I
think it goes very directly to some of the things that we've been talking about, what Riyaz said about we've not had enough of a public conversation about the value and the agency of architecture. That does not exist in the public realm enough. A lot of architecture students end up doing city planning, end up doing real estate, because architecture seems to have had an erosion of agency. What is the value of the larger value of architecture as a cultural product, not just as buildings?
Can I, just for the purposes of devil's advocacy, disagree with you all and say actually it's the reverse? I mean, you look at Babri Masjid, and you look at Central Vista, and now you look at IIM and many other projects. The public and the political processes are very aware of the power of architecture, which is why they deploy it to such tremendous effect politically. If architecture had no agency, they wouldn't give a shit. They'll be like, keep your stupid buildings. We don't care. We're going to build another campus outside. It would be very simple, sort of an expedient. Is it not possible that, in fact, architecture has huge place in the public imagination that perhaps we don't, which is precisely the reason why it is being attacked? I'm just offering this as a contention.
Maybe there's a distinction between Babri Masjid, which is absolutely a symbol, and the dorms coming down where the idea of this legacy is not acknowledged, which is why they're coming, which is why one.
I don't know if the local community of Ayodhya would have agreed with you that Babri Masjid is just a symbol, or Central Vista, or Tagore Theatre in Chandigarh, or Pragriti Maidan, or they all have communities.
Yes.
No, I think that there's something there in what you say, Vikram. I mean, I think I've been thinking about demolitions particularly more than buildings. And I think that it's ironic that modern architecture, the word Shubhra used is genesis, which I like very much, is the genesis of modern architecture is intrinsically tied with demolition, whether you look at Haussmann in Paris, whether you look at the World Wars, or whether you look at the end of modernism, as Mr. Jenks put it, with Fluid Ego, that famous demolition.
The celebrated demolition.
Yeah. So, but if you really look into that, it ties up with negligence as well in what happened to the administrative processes to that housing. I think there's what demolition does is certainly quite symbolic, and you can extend that to the Bamiyan, you can extend that to 9/11, etc., etc. So my point is this: that if you were, and I'm going to jump a bit, if you were to take Victor Hugo's contention that architecture is now no longer the holder of public memory with the invention of the printing press, I think we are going back to realizing that it's much more difficult to erase histories that are embedded in buildings than are written on books, because the text has become so subjective. You can tweet it in 140 characters and you may not be able to tell the truth, but there is something about physicalities that is returning when there is a kind of, when you can't put your finger on what you read. And I think in that sense, we are coming back to realizing, maybe with a public intuition, if you'd like to call it that, that the memories, if you want to change the way we write history, And that's happening in India, I mean, at a scale that we cannot imagine. I mean, in 4 years to aim to discredit somebody like Romira Thapar is incredible in itself. It's a project of immense precision and scale and hard work. You can't deny that. But the point is, if that's the level at which you want to rewrite history, then you will have to demolish buildings. Because they hold history in a very different way than text. And I think that's where these stories intertwining between architects and historians and lay people thicken that goo, that talks about these histories and makes them much more resilient. So, even temples that are demolished, you still hear stories of them in lore. Because that goo is so thick that it persists centuries.
I liked your earlier thesis better, which is that in the age of 140 characters of the Twitter age,
Right.
Suddenly architecture is making a comeback.
I thought you'd like that, Vikram.
I did like
playing
that.
to the gallery, man.
Man, thank you. And I took the bait 100%. Is that a viable thesis?
Who knows, man?
It's an interesting thesis because it brings that black and white between written and oral into a little bit of a blurring, because yes, there is physical evidence. Buildings are kind of analogous to written repositories, but unlike sculptures, buildings, whether they're authored or whether they are not, whether it's designed by DDA, PWD, or not even an architect or an engineer, or the most famous architect in the world, they get inhabited and another set of histories begin to develop, which is kind of like oral. And so it is, in some sense, to counter the director's own questioning of whether in today's day and age of pandemic and virtual working, this, that, and the other, are physical spaces even important? I don't mean to make fun of him. I mean, if we just
it's a present discourse
provocation. Exactly. They do, because ultimately, yes, our words and ideas are an ether, but buildings have and physical places have another way we sort of.
The brick has weight, does it not?
They have that weight and gravitas and heft. And
holding a brick in your hand,
yeah.
I think that this idea of empathy is one that is produced like this. It is produced through collective memory, cultural memory. And here, I think this is sort of where Maurice Hobwax again meets Kevin Lynch kind of thing. It's this idea that there is a thickness of stories that have to be told, produced, collected in order to create an empathy for what is otherwise considered to be brutalist architecture. And I think Kahn is one example, but the real brutalist architects like Paul Rudolph have had massive violence committed on their buildings. So many Paul Rudolph buildings have recently been demolished. And it's this idea that empathy should extend or can extend into something that has been labeled brutalist. And I think that needs to be mined.
I think that's an interesting idea. Empathy is, empathy was invented as a word in the early 20th century as part of German kind of phenomenology, early Gestalt kind of thinking. In part as related to sort of psychoanalytic thinking, but in part it was against the slide into discourse. It was kind of a resistance to that, So through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we have given so much footage to the idea of conversation, discourse, sociality, structuralism, conversation, socius, and so on.
That's very interesting because it ties empathy, ties also to pathos.
Yes,
and pathos.
These are very body-related things. These are not discursive.
Absolutely.
They insist on a certain emotional ontology, you know,
an intimacy.
kind of a body agency, different from a Arendtian, post-structuralist, socialist, almost, I would argue even Kevin Lynchian social conversation based thinking.
No, but it also goes back to, you know, buildings are not just utilitarian things, they are playgrounds. I mean, the way I remember IIM arches is purely by the way, especially those round ones, going back to, you know, knowing them as a child, knowing those purely in terms of, as kids, we used to sort of play a game. Who can go the furthest, you know, before they have to stop? Because, you know, you climb them at some point, you're going to...
Shubhra, how did you manage? Tell us about climbing up the arches.
I went almost like from, if this is 90, I probably went up to like 25 degrees.
Acha?
I mean, obviously you can't go full.
How did you
climbing on the arches? Because they
did you like crawl up? Did you hold from the sides?
So
or
you
did
start
you have
with the
suckers
feet.
on your hand?
No, you start with the feet, but very quickly you have to go on all fours because you need the... But it goes back. But it actually goes back to, you know, there are, whether it is site-specific theater, device theater, etc., these sort of disciplines allow you to re-engage and re-inhabit buildings in ways in which even the users break their habit. So suddenly, you know, railings become something else, tabletops become something else. And these are also wonderful ways. I mean, this is nothing to do with IIM per se, but the idea being, we all fall into habits. And if we are going into the direction of empathy and embodied knowledge and inhabitation, the intimacy of the body, using the body as a tool to register, rather than abstract like scales and cameras and measure tapes, then suddenly you're talking about a completely different notion. And as architects, you are returning to practice where maintenance becomes, you will know how big something is or how rough something is if you're cleaning it yourself. You will know how to reimagine functions if you're doing it yourself, where at one time it's a dining room, another time it's a bedroom, just by not having fixed furniture. Except what I'm trying to say is, even as users, we fall into habit. And this whole business of empathy, empathizing even with your built environment, not just with each other, is a way of also playfully re-engaging with what is built.
And there is an ecological vector to this.
In fact, that is a severely important imperative. I mean, what are we talking about ultimately? You know, 16-year-olds are asking us, what the hell are you doing?
Yes,
that should be, if there's nothing else, that should be a reason to sort of look at even the practice of architecture. What is this obsession with new and discarding growth. And also just discarding that which doesn't work, rather than tinkering and innovating our way through it.
A few years back, and it's by no means particular to this one thing, but a few years back, the Oslo Architecture Triennale had a theme on degrowth. And a lot of these conversations that we're having through the lens of IIM are absolutely the same conversations there. And it was essentially an idea of deep ecological concern. You know, how far can we just keep producing growth as something that cannot be questioned? You know, you have green growth, sustainable growth, but the word growth is not questioned. And how do we create other worlds where growth is to be questioned and even to be curtailed, perhaps?
How that's a good discussion. Now, as we move towards the end over here, kind of a sort of a last round of discussion here, let us focus on this idea of the next generation, right? I mean, if we are saying we are doing heritage not just for memory, but for a different vision of the future for our children and grandchildren. It's a difficult thing, you know, India, Africa, Asia in general, China for sure, is so focused on growth, right? What is this your idea here, Sarosh? I mean, what is the relationship between rethinking growth and preservation or conservation as managing change?
I think it is hugely intertwined and hugely correlated. Of course, the larger question is has been raised, and there is at least 50, 60 years of a movement here that one can trace all the way from the Good Earth catalog or Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, or The Limits of Growth, which is the Club of Rome 1972 document. But this idea that we have created a world where this singular pursuit of growth is actually literally destroying us, and has destroyed the planet in a way in which we will already not be able to recover from it. Thinking about something like the sixth species extinction, the sixth mass extinction that we are going through right now. And so this idea, and I think it is particularly relevant to developing economies. It is particularly relevant to places like China, places like India, where there is a legitimate argument saying that the West has already consumed so much carbon, and now what is the audacity of the West to tell us not to do the same thing? And so I think this notion of imagining another world is really, really important. And there one must try to find, even within the hard disciplines like economy, try to find other ways of measuring. That becomes so important. So for example, Kate Raworth has written a book called Donut Economics, where she actually looks at economics through two rings, which becomes the donut. The outer ring being the limits of the planet, ozone, species depletion, water, climate change, carbon. But the inner ring is one of human parameters, poverty, child development, maternal mortality, things like that. And I think that at least creates a more holistic way of thinking about economics, not GDP. And I think that herein conservation is hugely important, because one of the biggest myths, one of the biggest problems with GDP related growth is what they call, and economists use this word a lot, negative externalities. Right? Negative externalities means you don't account for pollution, you don't account for embodied energy, you don't account for all the things that were burnt to make those bricks. As soon as you start measuring these things, you realize that conservation is hugely ecological, and conservation is a mode of thinking of another world.
How does this idea of rethinking growth sit with you guys, Riyaz and Shubhra, in terms of IIM again?
Before we go to IIM, just to sort of extend what Sarosh was saying, it's kind of like, we constantly keep seeking new answers, asking the same question. And this business of growth, I'm reminded of, Gautam Bhan talks often about his critique to just building new housing, because the narrative is India needs housing, right? And he just shifts the focus and the emphasis from building new to just recognizing that which is already there. In terms of, instead of calling them slums, they are already bastis, which means neighborhoods. You give them, you lease the land to them, therefore they have a sense of ownership, and something else develops. You have changed the terms of engagement. And that is what I hope when I was talking about reimagining the master plan, reimagining what it means to be an institute within a city, something other than a citadel, which doesn't mean just blast open the boundary walls formally. But if you begin, in IIM's case, again, changing the terms of engagement, then you don't look at your problem as a lack of land interfering with growth. And so really simply, now, I don't obviously have all the answers, but these are some of the things that you begin to, based on what people are already asking, linked to, are there ways of just simply asking new questions?
Different questions.
Regarding the state we are in, I think there are possibilities. And that is what an attitude to reusing, caring for what is around us, caring for where we are headed, pushes us to do, rather than just this pursuit of the new,
And the more.
paradoxically asking the same old questions.
Yeah.
We are never going to come up with new outcomes, just new looking outcomes, which is fundamentally different. So,
Vikram, in this context, and I think both Sarosh and Shubhra have alluded to it, that what I think pits, let's say, heritage versus development in itself is because in terms of heritage and conservation, and when I use this word, I no means mean only building heritage and building conservation. I mean, I'm talking about the guys who are looking at the conservation of forests as heritage of the Adivasis. And if you really look at this carefully, and I alluded to it earlier, it is those communities that who look at these as heritage and as a need and the need for conservation. It's precisely those sites which are under attack, whether it's Medha Patkar and the forest and the Adivasi movements. You look at it across the country here. So I'm talking about heritage and conservation at that scale. And I think because it presumes a paradigm in which we can define what is enough. And it does not, in a paradigm of infinite growth, what is enough can never be defined. And I mean, we've got 350,000 plus houses lying vacant. And if you move around, even though it's COVID lockdown time, it's astounding the amount of construction that's going on in Ahmedabad, including on IIM. Okay, so I mean, I'm just saying that at what point are you going to say the city has grown enough? Is it going to be an organism that grows to failure? Or, I mean, is that what it is? Or is that because of its growth, we will have to come up with new infrastructure in order to feed this animal that is, infinitely. It's not possible. Already we are seeing structural collapses. We are seeing ghettoization, which means we've got multiple cities within a city. That's basically what a ghetto is. It's a community that just, it's reached a scalar limit. Right. So I'm just saying that unless we are and I think one of the at the core, what heritage does, it says we've got enough. Let's take care of what we have. That's what it says to me. If I'm to explain to a simple guy why I'm walking around the whole city saying that you should preserve this 600-year-old precinct. I'm basically saying there's enough building here to house 68,000 families. It's housing stock and it's got character. And 68,000 houses is a lot of housing. If one demystifies this a little bit and says that there's value and there's material, and there are places in which the two come together, and one must be able to recognize that. Then in some places you keep the material for material's sake, and in some cases you keep the value for value's sake, and in some you keep it for both. IIM happens to be a place where we recognize that you perhaps should keep it for both. And I think that's how I would look at it. And it's just saying that there's enough here for us to do many things with this. And I think in that sense, one can posit the heritage trajectory as something quite radical, something quite creative, rather than it being looked at in this, typical way of nostalgia,
nostalgia versus growth, past.
To further what Riyaz said just a little bit, it's very interesting when the director Errol D'Souza responded in his letter. He said that it's important to distinguish between legacy and heritage, and the letter was all about, or part of the letter was all about distancing the project from the word heritage. And he said, while I accept legacy, heritage is a whole other thing. And I think that is very interesting, because what has happened is that we've created like was said, we've created at least in the context of Ahmedabad and India, perhaps, we've created a place where the word heritage comes with a huge baggage. And I think that there needs to be more deliberation on how we can actually think of this creatively, have incentives to people to whom we ascribe this word, to buildings and to traditions to whom this word is ascribed to, and the larger kind of frameworks of legality and governmentality and bureaucracy that surround, for lack of a better term, movement of heritage. And I think it's important to open it up and to make it more creative, less bureaucratic, and something that is more about sustenance and less about fossilization and artifact.
On that, thank you, Sarosh, Riyaz, Shubhra. Thank you so much for taking time on 3 different continents to have this conversation with me for Architecture Talk. Thanks for your petition on IIM and all the work that you have been doing.
Hey, thanks so much.
Thank you, Vikram. Pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.